What should I make? Aloha! Welcome to this video. I'm going to be making my second Gunstock Warclub. So when I was making the first one, I was just constantly filled with ideas and what I wanted to do, and limited by the amount of material I had on the first one. And so I was really excited to get going on this one and explore and see what I was going to do. So a couple large changes that are going to be on this one. So on the first one I used a fossilized megalodon tooth as the blade. On this one I'm going to be using deer antlers. Deer antlers actually were used occasionally for Gunstock Warclubs. I don't know how often, hard to find too many pictures of them, but it does look like they were used occasionally. So I'm a little bit more excited with that. It's a little bit more reminiscent of traditional Gunstock Warclubs. The other thing I'm going to be doing though is I'm going to be adding a little bit more Hawaiian designs into the Gunstock Warclub. Not decorative designs, but shape, as well as some bull shark teeth. I'm really excited about that. So all I'm doing here is I sketched out the first version, just kind of the idea that I had in my mind, and then here I'm just going through and playing with different shapes and ideas and what I might be going for. Same with the other one. I don't really have a clear picture as to what this is going to look like. I'm really just kind of debating as I go along the shape, and what I ended up doing was going with a little bit more traditional style, this traditional shape, with regards to the thicker end, to a Gunstock Warclub, where it looks more like a gunstock. And then I introduced some Hawaiian shapes. So the end of the club, where it has almost that diamond shape, that triangle and diamond shape is more indicative of Hawaiian and Polynesian designs. And then some of the edge work, as well as its overall just crisp design, is a little bit more Hawaiian. But then the actual full piece is the Gunstock Warclub. So what I'm doing here is I've already cut down these antlers. The antler I have here is, I think it's whitetail. I actually received this from my brother-in-law. It wasn't for a specific piece. He just knew I did stuff like this, and had an extra rack and gave it to me. So I'd been using a piece of it at a time as I go along. So I debated on how I was going to attach the deer antlers to the piece. Originally I wanted to embed the entire antler because the antlers are very tough, extremely robust. The problem I had though is the piece of koa wood I have here wasn't quite thick enough. It's only an inch thick, and those deer antlers were about 5/8 inch. And so what I was worried is if I inset the entire antler, that I wouldn't have enough wood or meat on the outer edges of the antler, and when I went to strike with it, it would break the wood or shatter it, crack it. And so what I ended up deciding to do is shaving down the bone, the antler, just enough so that I could inset a section of it, similar to a mortise and tenon joint, which you can see here on that image. The depth that I'm taking them down to is about an inch deep, and then I'm actually going to be putting in a cross pin after I have them set, and I'm also going to epoxy them into place. So they're going to be pretty solid. I would have preferred the entire antler bone, just because I really liked the way it looked, but once again I was kind of nervous about the width of the koa wood and how close the antler bone would come to the edges of the koa. But it worked out pretty well, so I was pretty excited about that. Once I got those sections cut out and ready, I went back to shaping. So I kind of did that early on just to make sure I wouldn't remove too much material from the wood. I was a little bit concerned that I'd remove too much, then go to cut out those notches for the antler bones, and it would be too thin, and I'd effectively ruin the piece. One thing I do on all my pieces is I always check their balance. I'm actually not entirely sure where these are supposed to balance, and so I was just trying to keep the balance close to where the blade would be. Well, it's not going to be a blade, it's going to be the antler bones, but close to that range. I do that just because or I did it on this one just because it felt a little bit better in the hands. It felt like it'd swing a lot better. It probably would throw really well too. So I've got the overall piece shaped down a little bit more. It's not quite to the point where I'm going to be bringing it down to sanding yet. But I also want to inset a pearl. So these here, this is abalone pearl. And so what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be insetting matching pieces. I decided to do a sphere, so I just have to clean up some of these here. And I'm just finding the closest drill bit that'll fit that. I wasn't sure where I was going to put it at first. I kind of debated on where on the piece I was going to have it. But these are going to be not an inlay, they're going to be an inset. And so what that means then is that the abalone pearl is going to stick out a little bit of the wood. It's not going to be perfectly flush. And usually when you do that, you take the wood, you pretty much finish it. It's one of the last things that you do is you inset that. And so I went ahead and got it sanded up to, I think it was 220. And then at 220, I'm going to go ahead and cut in the groove for the teeth and get ready to put in the teeth, the pearl, the antlers, and everything else. And so I'm just kind of planning things ahead. One of the things that I try to do, especially when I have a combination piece like this, especially when I don't have it fully planned out, is plan it as much as I can. Oftentimes when I'm making a custom piece for a client, I pre-work the design, or not often, every time. I pre-work the design, and so I have a pretty clear image of what the design is going to be before I even begin. When I do my own personal pieces like this, I really enjoy just kind of the journey. It's a lot of fun. So what I'm doing here is, rather than drilling all the way through, I'm going to be drilling in each side. I did that for a couple reasons. One, because I don't have a drill press and I wasn't confident in making a perfectly straight hole all the way through the end here. And the other reason is this is going to be an inset and I didn't want it to push too deep into the piece. One thing that I did, you'll see that here in just a little bit. So my drill bit wasn't quite big enough to fit the inset perfect, and so there's quite a bit of handwork. But as I went to inset the first one, I didn't take out enough material on the wood, and so the inset was just sticking way too far out. And originally, and this is this one here, you can actually see the little cup of epoxy. My original thought was I was going to epoxy those into place. And so I put epoxy on there and I got ready, and then I realized I couldn't get it out because it just wouldn't work. It was sticking too far out and I needed to get it out. So the idea that I had was to drill through the other side, just a small hole, and then get a nail and hammer it through. I was terrified though that I was going to just break that piece of pearl in half. Oh, that would have been horrible. Luckily I didn't. And then I was able to go back, widen it up a little bit, get it a little bit deeper, and get it more of a perfect fit. It ended up being such a tight fit that I didn't even worry about adding in epoxy or super glue or anything. I mean, you can tell here, so I've to soften the blows a little bit just so I don't break the pearl. I have the cloth going over top of it, and then a piece of wood, and then on top of that I'm hammering. But both sides were just such a close fit. I mean, tight fit. It was really difficult almost to get it in. I was a little bit worried that I was going to break the pearl. Luckily I didn't. But I definitely wasn't going to be pulling it back out. So I just left it like that. I figured if I can barely get that to set into place, then it's definitely not going to be coming up by itself anytime soon. So now that I have that in place, I'm going to go through and finish up with 320. I'm going to be sanding this piece down to 320. It actually has a really beautiful curl. It's kind of hard to see at this point in time because of how light the curl is against the grain. Some of the koa wood is just like that, but it's a really pretty curl that just goes across the whole thing. And so I was really getting excited to get to that step of the process. So now that I have everything sanded down to 320, I'm getting ready to put in the bull shark teeth. So these are 3/4 to 1 inch bull shark teeth, around that range. They're modern bulls. I'm going to be using a little bit of epoxy, and then I mix in koa wood, actually from the piece, to the epoxy, so just so it blends in a little bit better. I use the epoxy just to help it hold it while I drill it. So the epoxy isn't the main source of attachment for the teeth. I don't like to swim the teeth in epoxy. It's not my favorite thing to do. I just use it to kind of hold it in place while I drill it and lash it. Now that I have the teeth set mostly, I'm going to go ahead and put in the antlers. So one thing that you can't really see, I kind of skimmed past it, but in addition to having a cross peg, I also kind of wanted a center peg, almost like a center ream, just something inside that would go deeper into the wood. And so what I did is I drilled out both the wood and the bone. And the point of that is I then filled that with the epoxy, and I'm using a slower setting epoxy so it'll really harden up. And the idea there is that'll create a center spine for me so that it'll just increase the stability of the bones. I did inset them by 1 inch, but I was still a little bit nervous. That wasn't quite far enough. And when I was notching and getting the bones ready, the antlers, I didn't want to make that inset too deep because I wanted to have as much antler exposed as I could. I really loved the look of the antlers, and I wanted to have as much of that natural look as possible. I did sharpen the ends, but outside of sharpening the ends, I tried to keep the rest of the antler pretty natural looking. I just really liked the look of it. It looked really pretty, rugged, and felt like it'd be more natural. If that were, out in the wild, if they were to sharpen it, they wouldn't, sharpen the whole piece. They would sharpen just the ends. So here I put in those crossed beams. Those are 1/4 inch dowels, and it's just I debated using metal versus wood. I ended up going with wood. The reason why is I felt the wood would just match better with the overall piece. If I was using a metal blade, I probably would have used a metal peg and then peened it into place rather than wood. But with the aesthetic of the whole piece, I just really like the wood pegs a lot better. So before I get to oiling the piece, I need to drill out the teeth. I actually skipped a step here. I drilled out the teeth and totally forgot to drill out the holes. I usually do that before I oil it because I do all my sanding, but that's okay. It just meant I got to oil it a second time, but I only showed the first time here. So you can really start to see the curl on this piece. It has almost like a really tight, like a micro curl. It's kind of hard to see in this sliding, but as I'm just moving the piece, around here and there, you can really see that curl starting to present itself. Really beautiful. The handle itself had a really deep compression curl as well. A very high contrast in the colors, and you can see that there. I just absolutely love when the curl just comes out. Very beautiful. Had some nice contrast in colors too. You can see some little bit of edgewood to center wood. In fact, this piece came from a live edge, and so the edge where the bones are sticking into was originally the live edge, although I had removed the majority of the bark. So that actually is softer there, which isn't ideal for where you would embed those bones, but it worked out really well, and it ended up being very aesthetically pleasing. I was very pleased with it. The last couple steps here are going to be just lashing on the teeth once I drill in. I still can't believe I forgot that. So usually what I do is I do all of my drilling and cutting and all that stuff first, and the reason before I oil it, and the reason for that is I don't like to sand it again with heavy sandpaper once it's been oiled. I like to oil it, and then if I do any sanding after that, it's a light sand, almost like a wire, not a wire brush, like a steel wool or something that's really fine. And that's only when I'm working on pieces that have just an unbelievably rare curl. This is a very beautiful piece, and it does have a very heavy curl, but I didn't want to take it to such a fine grit. I kind of wanted to leave it a little bit rugged, and so I left it at the 320, sanded it, and oiled it. So here I'm lashing in the teeth. Lashing in the teeth is definitely Hawaiian Polynesian. I'm using my standard lashing pattern for this. I might use a different lashing pattern for one of the newer pieces I'm going to be working on, but I really like the way that this lashing pattern works, and it holds very stoutly. Now, I did also lash the handle. I totally forgot to hit my recorder when I did that. That was my mistake. So unfortunately, you won't get to see that, but you will get to see the finished piece here in just a second. So you can really see with the natural light the curl on this piece, that micro curl as it reflects on the natural light coming out. Absolutely beautiful. Oh, love it. This piece is just brutal too. Once I finished it, I gotta tell you, I was so excited to test with this. I had to wait a few days just because I didn't quite have the time to set everything up and to film it. But, oh, beautiful piece. It was a monster and an absolute blast to test with. So let's get into that testing. Ready? Mm-hmm. Ooh. Ready? Uh-huh. Did it? Uh-huh. I hope you enjoyed watching. This was an absolute blast. I really enjoyed making this piece. I wanted to make this style of Gunstock Warclub for a long time. The first one was a ton of fun, and this one really just implemented all of the different ideas that I had. I did strike it one more time, but I didn't go full strength. This was a pretty tough pumpkin, and so I didn't want to have to fix anything if I broke it. It did snap into it. The rest of the video is just my kids having fun, doing their best on the pumpkin. Aloha, and see you next time. Mahalo.
Oh. Good job. Nice.
I'm cracking the whole pumpkin.